My name is Professor Saeed Khan. It's my privilege and an honor to be not only chairing but being in conversation with my esteemed colleague here on Crimea, conflict, conquest, and consequence. As many of you, of course, are painfully aware, the Crimean conflict has been underway for well over 3 years in a rather brutal and violent manner. And yet, of course, it is one of many conflicts that are underway currently. Yeah. Oh, okay. This one felt so nice.
No, you have to change it from the Britney mic. There you go.
It's known as the Britney mic. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. Is that better? Okay, wonderful. As you're aware, at various stages in the news cycle, it seems as though, unfortunately, what's happening in the Crimean Peninsula tends to drop off because either of what's happening in the Middle East, and particularly what's happening in the domestic politics of either here in the United Kingdom, or, of course, in the United States, where it seems like every day brings on a new dimension of newsworthy coverage. But nonetheless, Crimea is still a flashpoint. But I think what we'll find this afternoon is that Crimea is not a new flashpoint. It's not necessarily a function of ideology, but perhaps more geographic or geography that then has framed the centrality of Crimea in the imagination of so many, and unfortunately in the conflicts of so many. So this afternoon we're going to take a longer view of Crimea specifically to see how it applause for Ella for just being still. We will see then how Crimea historically has had this positionality, this centrality as a little jutting out of into the Black Sea, and how it has shaped the destiny not only of the peoples there, but in many ways those to its east, those to its west, those to its north, and of course those to its south. Joining me today, a real privilege, Dr. Maya Petrovich, who specializes in the global history of Eurasian empires, particularly those with the interactions between the Islamic world and South Asia. She holds degrees from Hamburg, from Columbia, and from Princeton. And for 5 years, she was an associate researcher and a tutor at Oxford University with the ERC Nomadic Empires Project. Currently, she's the holder of the Yunus Emre Professorship in Turkish Culture at Trinity College Dublin. She is also trained in Germany as a psychotherapist and a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, and has published several academic articles and 2 books of poetry in her first native language of Bosnian, and is currently working on a multi-volume novel about Bronze Age Egypt and Canaan. Multiverse, as you can possibly imagine, with a very eclectic but very interesting set of topics. So take us back then, Maya, into where Crimea fits into this broader imagination sitting just north of the Mediterranean.
Well, first I think I might provide some comic relief as we test out the speaker here. I assume you can hear me, and please tell me if you cannot. Okay, lovely. First of all, I wish to extend my gratitude and my feeling of being honored of being here. It's my first time in Bradford, and I thank Saeed Khan very much, and I thank Ella for putting up with me because it wasn't entirely clear this would happen. I also wish to thank my home institution, Trinity College Dublin, and in some ways, most of all, the institution in which I participate, Yunus Emre Institute, with institutes in London and in Dublin. And if you should be so inclined, or if you know people who are interested in Turkish, it's a lovely place to study Turkish and to learn more about Turkish culture. And you can see on this poster their slogan, Turkish Unites. So let's now delve into the matter at hand. And as you have seen, this is actually in some ways an amusing juxtaposition because if you only saw our names, you would naturally assume that Saeed Khan, Professor Khan, is a specialist in the Indian Ocean, and that I would be a specialist in Eastern Europe. But in reality, it's a bit more complex than that. So let me start with a somewhat provocative group of statements. Let me talk about debates on whether Muslims belong in Europe. They tend to be very much focused on Northern and Western Europe and on developments of the last 50 years, and seemingly unavoidable debates about refugees, about immigrants, about assimilation. Now, as it happens, I am a former stateless refugee myself from the Balkans, turned American. And in Dublin, I teach a class on Islam in Europe. And I must admit that I experience a particularly wicked pleasure when the students realize that at least half of my class focuses on Southern Europe, meaning Al-Andalus, so Muslim Spain, and on long-seated Muslim communities in Southeastern Europe, especially the Balkans, of course. So, to my mind at least, the real question which we're facing, whether in Southern Europe or in Eastern Europe, is not whether Muslims belong in Europe, because they have been in Europe for centuries, but rather, what do you mean when you say Europe? Where does Europe end, especially to its east? And this question has been, of course, been on the mind of most British people, and I admit on mine as well in recent years, because of the manifold consequences of Brexit. Okay, what is the other provocative issue that I will somewhat address? Usually we think about the Crimean War from Western European perspective, again from a British, from a French perspective. There are many reasons for doing so. I mean, if you look at the importance of the Crimean War, let's see, I think it's so here is a monograph which I very much recommend on the Ottoman-Crimean War, the Ottoman experience of the Crimean War, but here you can see a couple of maps. Why was the Crimean War so important? Of course, we think about Florence Nightingale. But more importantly, in some ways, this was the only general European conflict between 1815 to 1914. Hard to believe, but true. And many of the features that we usually think about as modern appear during this time, as we will see. So we have photographs, we have trench warfare, we have telegraphs, we have an incredible number of people who died, around 700,000 people. We have the development of nursing, as we've seen Florence Nightingale. After the war, there are several important developments. There is the Ottoman Bank, and there is a second phase of the Tanzimat. In terms of the UK, of course, I will come back to a few words on the war in a second. We have the Scottish regiments. So these are often the faces that we think of when we think about the war. Now, the photographic evidence, and here is more. This famous painting, I believe, was even on the cover of a collection of Scottish Gaelic poetry that I have. So a collection of Scottish Gaelic poetry from the 19th century, and then they selected this particular image to illustrate it simply because of the importance. We need to, yeah, all right, that was my bad. Okay, so let's go back to the images in their full glory here. All right, so in terms of the location, yes, we think about the Crimea, we think about it from the Western point of view, but can we change that perspective for a bit? Can we think about it from the point of view of indigenous people? So, who is indigenous? And indigeneity, of course, is a big topic in our day as well, especially in the Middle East. Who belongs to a land? Who gets the right to stay? who gets the privilege of leaving, and so on. So I would like very much to focus on the Khanate of Crimea. This is a political entity which existed from the early 15th century until the conquest by the Russian Empire in 1783. And this Khanate was largely independent in terms of its state structure and in terms of its foreign policy, but it was also closely tied to the Ottoman Empire for a long time, from 1475 until 1774. And this is reflected in the fact that some of the major Turkish historians of modern-day Turkey are actually of Crimean Tatar origin. This includes such renowned names as Halil İnalcık and İlber Ortaylı. Now, these images that you see here actually are depictions of Crimean Tatars in the aftermath of the war, and they fit a larger theme of European curiosity about exotic lands. So you see a lot of depictions of women in particular, and a lot of focus on clothing. This fascination with Crimean Tatars as one of the unknown European others continues into our day. So, for instance, here we have the Jamala, who is the Crimean Tatar winner of Eurovision in 2016, was it, I believe? Yes, and she was singing the song largely in English with brief moments in the Crimean Tatar language. Saeed Khan will perhaps have a little more to say about this, but one of the interesting features of modern Ukrainian culture is that, unlike the earlier periods, let's say unlike the 17th century, when there was very much antagonism between Slavic speakers and Crimean Tatars, for reasons that I will explain in a moment, in contemporary Ukraine, there is a great sense of idealization of Crimean Tatars as a component of the Ukrainian nation that was somehow lost. So it signifies all kinds of things. It signifies nostalgia, it signifies connections across the Black Sea with the Ottomans. It signifies the injustice of the Russian imperial impositions, as well as the Soviet order. And again, you will hear a bit more about that. But if we think about this culture as a treasure chest, here represented as a real trunk, so with embroidery and so on, what is actually inside of this treasure chest? Who are Crimean Tatars behind a name and an exotic evocation? So here again is the Crimean Khanate, and so let's think about the linguistic background. We have, of course, the Ottoman Empire, where a Turkic language has been spoken since, let's say, the 12th century, so since the arrival of Turkic peoples, of Seljuks in Anatolia. And then we have the Crimean Tatars, and they both speak Turkic languages. However, those languages are not the same, they're close cousins, so the difference between them is somewhat like the difference between Italian and Spanish, or if you prefer, Swedish and spoken Danish. But the main difference is really in their political culture. The Ottomans went through a long historical process of intimate connections with Persian speakers, with Greek speakers, Arabic speakers, Caucasian speakers of Caucasian languages, including Georgian, including Armenian. So all of this forms the Ottomans. All of this forms also the modern nation-state of Turkey. So all of this contributes toward a unique imperial culture, which is both Muslim and Mediterranean. But when we look across the Black Sea, we actually see something quite different. So the people who lived in the Crimean Khanate, they were also Sunni Muslims, just like the majority of Turks of Anatolia. And their language also belonged to a Turkic family of languages, but their imperial culture came from very different roots. It found its origins in the Genghis Khan conquests, so Genghis Khan of Mongolia. Of course, we all know about him because he and his successors established the largest continental empire into our times. Mongol conquest of this area is inextricably connected with the Kievan Rus. So this was blazingly fast. They started moving into Western Eurasia in the 1220s. Then they conquered Kiev in 1240, moving into Poland, moving into Hungary soon afterwards. They did not hold Central Europe for very long, of course, but the Mongol rule was very significant in terms of Russian and Ukrainian history, because Russian princes continued paying tribute to Mongol states until about 1480. Of course, everyone is fascinated with the Mongols. It was one of my favorite classes at Columbia University, because when you entered it, it was taught by this wonderful person who was Jewish from Egypt. But then in the audience, you would find everyone from, leathermen with 1,000 piercings to pleasant young ladies whose parents worked for the United Nations, to elderly members of the community who were over 80 years old. So it was, in many ways, in terms of the audience, in terms of the composition, the most fascinating class that I have ever taken. So yes, everyone likes to think about the Mongols these days and the nomads. But in terms of this place, in terms of Crimea, in terms of the way in which Crimea came to be, there was constant quarrel among the Mongol elite, and then the Eastern European lands ended up forming a chunk of the empire, so the so-called Golden Horde, or the Ulus of Juchi, Genghis Khan's first son. This large territory lasted for some 2 centuries, but, so you can see here, Khanate of the Golden Horde, pretty central on the map. It lasted in some form for 2 centuries, but because of internal dissent, it fragmented into several smaller states over the course of time. And now, even though the Crimean Tatars emerged out of this Mongol and Jinghisid political culture, so originally not Muslim at all, they came to be largely Turkish and Muslim in character. Of course, other post-Mongol states were similar. So here we can see this area, this entire steppe. Western Eurasia converted to Islam, Eastern Eurasia converted to Buddhism, and this also gradually created many differences between those Mongol speakers and Turkic speakers who intermingled in this area. But what made Crimean Tatars truly unique was their geographical position, because they were at the very margins of the Mongol realm, yet they were associated with the sea as much as they were associated with the steppe. When you take classes about the Mongols, one of the things that you learn is that it took them very, very long time to conquer places, such as there's an island off the coast of Korea. They did not like crossing it. They had a lot of problems with crossing the Indus. So they had a natural aversion towards crossing large rivers and seas. They eventually overcame it, but it took some time. So in that particular respect, the Crimean Tatars are unique, because they belong to the peninsula of Crimea, they belong to the hinterlands, and they draw both upon the rich Ukrainian steppe and upon the wealth of the sea. And in that respect, they resemble much, much earlier cultures. I regret that I didn't include a slide, I simply didn't think about it, of their nomadic predecessors. So if you look at the antique period, we will hear about the Scythians, about their famous gold. A few years ago, there was a significant exhibition in London about the Scythians. So if you have the time, take a look at their heritage as well, because it is very much pertinent long term. But with the joint shock of COVID and the Russian military push into Ukraine in 2022, many people became suddenly aware just how much the world, especially the Middle East and parts of Europe, were dependent upon the smooth production and distribution of grains from the Ukrainian steppe. Crimean Tatars, strangely, could endure for entire days on horseback without consuming much grain at all. And this is something quite particular to most nomadic cultures, that they usually do not produce grain. This is where they enter kinds of symbiosis with sedentary peoples because they need grain. But Ukrainian soil is spectacularly fertile. It's this unique black soil. If you look at statistics, Egypt, Turkey, they are both dependent to about 60 to 70% for their grain importation on the Russian Federation and on Ukraine. So these political developments very much decide who actually gets to eat and how much in the Middle East. Again, another hot, uncomfortable topic. In terms of this period, this encounter between the steppe, between the fertile Black lands and the flourishing Black Sea trade created a unique culture and society, one which drew on all of its resources, including agricultural grain production, including pastoral nomadic resources, including also vibrant trade with Genoese Italian colonies, as well as Byzantines and later Ottomans. Of course, since we live in a world which is dominated by trade, which is fascinated by trade, we tend to think about, we tend to admire entrepreneurial spirits. And Crimean Tatar elites, as well as Crimean Tatar commoners, both showed evidence of that in their interactions to the empires to their south, so their interactions with the Genoese, their interactions with the Ottomans. But there was also a dark side to that engaging spirit, and that was massive slave trade. And here, let's look at a fictionalized version of that. The most famous captive who arrived in the Ottoman lands through the slave trade was a Ukrainian woman, supposedly daughter of a priest called Alexandra Lisevska, and in Ottoman lands, Hürrem Sultan, Hürrem means joyous. She made it to Istanbul as one of the many slaves, and then her career was quite spectacular because she became the main concubine and later the only wife of the most powerful Ottoman Sultan, Süleyman the Magnificent. So this is mid-16th century. And some of you will have heard of the Magnificent Century. So this is a spectacularly popular Turkish production focusing on her life and times, and watch it if you get the chance. So you can see there is a lot that is fascinating when we take a closer look at Crimean Tatars. Here are a few images. So here you have a stamp depicting Roxelana or Hürrem in Ukraine. I'm sorry that the slides are being a bit mischievous here. This is a statue, below is a statue depicting her in what is supposedly her hometown. So here is her tomb. This is in Istanbul, so she's not buried with the Sultan, but she's buried in the same complex, so this is the Mania complex. And this is a depiction of a Crimean Tatar princess. So she is depicted as more free-spirited, horse-riding. You have this entire idealization of independent and strong Turkic women, steppe women. So you can see there is a lot that is truly fascinating when we take a closer look at Crimean Tatars. The ruling class derived its descent from Genghis Khan. Let me get more pleasant. And for a long time they received regular tribute from the Polish king, from the Muscovite Tsar, consisting of cash, of costly tributes, especially furs which just like Kashmiri shawls, were so valued in Istanbul that it was possible to buy an entire house for only one of them. Additionally, Crimean Tatars sent their sons to the Ottoman court to be educated there, and many of them served in Ottoman military campaigns, whether in Iran or in Eastern and Central Europe. While much of the land was owned by 4 ruling Tatar clans, there was also a significant number of free farmers, some of which were Turkic, others were Slavic-speaking, and this is how a complex culture of both clashes and peaceful interactions emerged across the steppe. Okay, 1 second, please. And I will not delve very deeply into it, but it is truly a fascinating topic because what we realized is that the Cossacks of Ukraine and Crimean Tatars were mirroring each other. Many Tatars were born to Slavic-speaking Christian mothers. Many Cossacks also engaged in similar opportunistic raids in plunder, and they married Turkic-speaking women. They had children with them. So we have 2 fascinating sides of the same coin. Repeated defeats of the Ottoman armies in Eastern Europe, led to 1700 Treaty of Istanbul. This is when the tide starts turning against the Crimean Tatars. So we have the Polish king and the Russian Tsar who stopped paying their tribute to the Tatars. And the Cossacks occupied the important fortress of Azov or Azov. The result was an economic and social crisis throughout the century. The ruler of the Tatars had been educated in Greece and in Venice. He had tried to implement European military reforms, but in the end the Russian Empire prevailed, so Crimea was annexed fully to the Russian Empire in 1783. There was a first wave of migrations to the Ottoman Empire. This was followed by a second one a few decades later as a consequence of the Crimean War. So with the Crimean War, of course, this is a war which lasts from 1853 until 56. And as I mentioned before, we have several places where this war takes place. It starts out actually in the area of today's Romania and Moldova, and the pretext is a quarrel between the Russian Empire and the French and the English over Jerusalem specifically, and then that extends into who is going to be the protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. So perhaps surprisingly to us from our current point of view, the British Empire and the French side with the Ottomans against the Russians. So we have all of those different fronts. We have the front in Romania, in Moldova. We have an Eastern Anatolian front in the city of Kars. And we have a collapse, complete collapse of the Ottoman fleet, which is attacked by the Russians in the city of Sinop and destroyed within a matter of a day or two. And then we have finally the arrival of the British, French, and Ottoman troops to some extent in Crimea itself, in the Russian port of Sevastopol, which is then conquered, and in a certain sense, the game resets to what it was before the war, and in other senses, the world has irrevocably changed. And so we actually have a second flood of people, of Crimean Tatars, coming into the Ottoman Empire. And throughout the century, they will be joined by other Muslim populations from the Caucasus, because there is very much this Russian imperial ideal of shuffling people around if they are accused of treason. And this is something which we face in the 20th century as well. Let's see. So thank you for your patience. So we have one of the fastest deportation operations in human history. This occurred in the 1940s, so 1944. Crimean Tatars, or most of them, the large majority of the population, they were exiled by Stalin to Central Asia, especially to Uzbekistan. They were accused of collaboration with Nazi Germany. Almost half of the deported population died as a consequence of this drastic move. It was only in 1989 that they and their descendants were allowed to return to Ukraine. Most diasporan communities, which you see here, and again, apologies for the trouble with the slides, most diasporan communities are still scattered across Central Asia, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, to some extent Ukraine. They have lost their language, but its cultural importance remains high. So in Turkey, we have a long-established society of Crimean Tatar culture, and they in fact publish a bilingual magazine. So in that respect, it is very similar to the fate of Scottish Gaelic, which is still a living language, still an alive language, but also a heritage language. So very much at the edge. Okay, so let me just add a few cultural matters, and one of them is the Ottoman fascination with Tatars as a whole. And Ottomans, contrary to what you might assume, did not particularly like Genghis Khan and his descendants. They had, their cultural narrative had been taken over from the mainstream Abbasid narrative, from the classical Islamic times, with the destruction of apologies, with the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. So for the Ottomans, partially because of the later arrival of Timur in the early 15th century, for the Ottomans, there was actually a basically negative attitude toward the Mongols. And the case was very, very different among Crimean Tatars. Among Crimean Tatars, there was this idealization of Genghis Khan and of that aristocratic lineage. At the same time, when we look at Ottoman sources, when we look at Ottoman poetry, they maintain this very deep fascination with Tatars. In a certain sense, they respected them for, their ability to live in the steppe. And so they also saw them as perhaps not entirely Muslim, somewhat suspicious. So you have this trope, this idea that you still have shamans. So in this 16th century Ottoman poem, you have mention of a black Tatar shaman bringing rain with a magic stone. Then we have other descriptions. The beloved is actually compared in his or her beauty to Tatar soldiers. The lashes are Tatar soldiers, in fact, and the beloved himself is a Mongol, is Hülagü. So the way that Ottomans refer to this culture, the significance that the culture has for them, is really complex. And again, the deeper you go into it, to realize just how many different strands they are. Now, to conclude my part of the presentation, I will show you a few buildings. So here we have Crimean Tatars who now live again in Ukraine, so you can see their characteristic flag. And here we see members of the community, and there are lovely images of the imperial palace. This was built through a very long process between the 15th and the 18th century. Now this is one of the minor cities in the Crimea, and here you can see the way it looks like from the inside. Again, this combination of the 18th century and the earlier aesthetics. Here is the earliest mosque, which is still preserved in that area. And here, and of course now the slide behaves again, we have another shot of the palace. So, again, there is more to say, perhaps during the Q&A, but I think I have spoken for long enough, so I would like to.
Well, thank you. I think what's really fascinating about when you mention the Crimeans having a maritime tradition, they position themselves well because in 1368, the founder of the Ming Dynasty decided to close the Silk Road. And that meant that the major overland route from China all the way to Europe was ruptured. But trade, like nature from the movie Jurassic Park, always finds a way. And so we find then that the seafaring routes become very vital. And of course, Crimea becomes a strategic point, particularly for not only the Khanates that are there, but then also Russia as a whole. On top of that, it's of course also important to recognize that the Black Sea still has a choke point in the Turkish Straits. And so in order to get to the Mediterranean, you have to either make nice with the Ottomans and before them the Byzantines, which was easier for the Russians because the Byzantines were Greek, Eastern Orthodox Christian. But after 1453, with the conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed II, is now falling into Ottoman hands. The idea then that you either pay the toll keeper or that you go and try to conquer the Ottoman Empire and take control of the Turkish Straits essentially then becomes the narrative for the next 400 to 500 years. And let me see a show of hands. How many of you have been to Istanbul? Okay. How many of you have been to or on the Bosphorus? Okay. And how many of you are swimmers? Okay. How many of you swam the Bosphorus? Okay. If you notice, the Bosphorus at certain points is narrow enough that if you had some skills as a swimmer, you could actually swim straight across. It's that compressed. And so imagine then that being a choke point that is going to bring people back and forth between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and how vital that is. And that was something that was noticed, as Maya said, not only by Russia and those empires that were in the region, but those empires that were aspiring to be bigger empires to the west. England, France, and then neighboring Russia. And particularly in the 19th century, you find then that the foreign policy of these three empires was dominated by what was known as the Greater Eastern Question. All three had as their objective the end of the Ottoman Empire, but none of them could trust one another to do it on their own because it would severely tilt the balance of power. If Britain did it, it would be to the detriment of France and Russia. If France did it, it would be to the detriment of Britain and Russia. And if Russia did it, it would be to the detriment of the British and the French. And if you recall in the early 19th century, all three of these empires were fighting each other. You had the Anglo-French conflict, which ends in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. Prior to that, of course, you have the very ill-fated winter campaign of Napoleon to Russia. And then the Crimean War becomes this manifestation where you have Russia on one side, and interestingly enough, the British and the French fighting on the side of the Ottomans. So you really would need a laminated card, or I guess now with technology, an app, to keep straight who is on whose side when it comes to this. And I think that that kind of almost foreign policy schizophrenia in many ways is not only a reflection on the empires and their objectives, but also the centrality of Crimea and the Black Sea as a whole. And you find that if you fast forward to today, Crimea still is in the imagination of many parties that are concerned. So when it was part of the Soviet Empire until 1991, there was a recognition for the Soviet Union that it still occupied a very critical area within the broader geopolitics, and particularly this then shaped the entire Cold War. The fact that Turkey was the easternmost country in NATO at the time is because of containment of the Soviet Union finding its way into, after all, this is the only warm water access it has. Vladivostok in the east isn't an option, the Baltics are not an option getting out, plus it's just simply too long a journey going through Scandinavia to get to the North Sea and to the Atlantic. So we find then that NATO plays a very important role in containing not only the Soviet Union, but the influence and the importance that Crimea has. 1991, of course, changes everything with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine. Now, what to do with Ukraine, because there are two very vital elements that it has that are both dear to the Soviet Union. One, of course, is its major naval base at Sevastopol. And through treaty and agreements, Moscow and Kyiv decide that Sevastopol can still be in the hands of Russia. That was probably a good move, and I don't think, even though Kyiv might regret that now, it was a smart and wise move to have. The other was, what do you do with the nuclear arsenal that the Soviet Union had placed in the Ukraine? At one time, the nuclear arsenal that was in the Ukraine was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world behind Russia, or the United States and Russia. So in 1994, there was the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine agreed by treaty to give up its nuclear arsenal, to have it decommissioned, in exchange of a pledge from Western countries to protect it and defend it. That didn't age well. Along with that, there was, across the 1990s, a kind of a fervor and a frenzy in Western countries to perhaps not vindictively go after the former Soviet Republic, but certainly take on the opportunity to embrace not only former Soviet republics, but also those countries which were on the outer ring, what would be known as the Warsaw Pact. And if you remember, throughout the 1990s, there were these invitations that were going to the former Warsaw Pact countries to be given aid, to be given help when it came to establishing their fledgling democracies by Western countries. And slowly but surely, all of these then moved to the other side of the ledger. Poland, former Czechoslovakia, which then became Czechia and Slovakia. East Germany, of course, was absorbed and reunited with West Germany. But then you also go further down to Romania and Bulgaria, and what was once this counterweight to NATO now is actually being welcomed and given bids into the European Union and into NATO itself. Well, a former KGB agent by the name of, and you've heard of him, Vladimir Putin, is sitting here watching the erosion of once Soviet, but really Russian influence, a very proud and long-lasted civilization and society, and feeling in many ways helpless to really do something about this. You probably also remember that during the Balkan Wars, Russia saw itself as the patron and the defender of Serbia, particularly in the UN Security Council, and would block any kind of resolutions that were critical of Serbia, forcing or perhaps enticing the Western powers to use NATO as the impetus to launch airstrikes against Serbia. Well, Putin was a patient man, and as he saw what was happening, he was certainly not happy with it. But then there was another level of encroachment. It wasn't just Western intrusion into the former Warsaw Pact, it was into former Soviet republics. The Baltics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become part of the European Union, become part of NATO. And if you remember at the start of the 21st century, this was also something that was being offered to other countries around the Black Sea, including Ukraine. Western countries saw the strategic importance of Ukraine, they saw the geographic importance of Ukraine, and of course, it is highly likely that had Ukraine joined NATO and the EU, that Ukraine would then have to rescind the treaty and agreement it had with Russia to have the naval base under Russian control at Sevastopol in Crimea. Well, Viktor Yushchenko was elected president of Ukraine, and apparently Putin felt that his affinity toward the West was not a good idea. Now, I'm not saying, because I don't know for sure, but if you recall, Yushchenko had a change of at least complexion. He was, it has been confirmed, poisoned by dioxin, which caused his face to essentially age and necrofy almost overnight. I mean, this is real mob boss kind of stuff. He apparently has, thanks to, I think, both the fact that dioxin finally escaped and maybe some good dermatologists, he's definitely looking better, and it didn't kill him, but it was clearly a message to him. Similarly, we found that when Ukraine was leaning toward joining the EU and NATO, Russia simply turned the spigot off in 2005 to its natural gas, and Ukraine almost froze to death. A similar issue happened in 2008 when the former Soviet Republic of Georgia was looking to maybe move into further the Western orbit, and Putin sends in troops into Georgia. This helps stage the backdrop of what happened in 2014, when there seemed to be, with a new election in Kyiv, another perhaps interest that Ukraine had in going further to the west. The invasion there was, of course, one that takes over the vast majority of the Crimean Peninsula, and we find that 3 years or actually 3 years ago, Putin makes another push in this direction, emboldened by what he sees as Western ambivalence or perhaps Western reluctance to counter Russian expansion into many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, including into Syria. So all of this, in many ways, still has Crimea at its core, has Crimea at its hub, as we try to then understand what is happening currently in the conflict over the last 3 years. With that, I'd like to open up, thank you, the questions for you in the audience. I know that we have covered a lot of territory, both chronologically as well as topically. So we are going to have some roving mics go on. So if you wouldn't mind just raising your hand and just introducing yourself to us with whatever question you have for either of us. Thank you.
Where can you find more information on this? As in, what sources would you recommend in terms of reading and also listening as well? Thank you.
Maya, I think that's probably a question for you on source material that you could recommend.
Yeah, I unfortunately do not have, I should have brought my computer, you would have seen more materials there, but this again is a book which I very much recommend, and I'm aware that most Braille books that their prices are quite hefty, so this is one way to access the Ottoman view on things. Another work which might be very helpful in terms of the Ottoman Empire at large, there are two authors. One of them is Gabor Agoston. He's a Hungarian who specializes in Ottoman history. So this is called an encyclopedia of Ottoman history, of the Ottoman Empire, and I believe that should be affordable. So if you look around, Encyclopedia of the Ottoman Empire is one volume. It should be, somewhere between 30 to 50 pounds, so not as exorbitant as the Braille books. And that one has the particular advantage of including a lot of Eastern European locations, because one of the authors is Hungarian, is a specialist in Eastern Europe. So whenever I teach classes which involve Ottoman engagement in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, it is one of my first points to go to.
I would also recommend books on Ottoman history by Stafford Shaw. He does a really good job, particularly in this period. I know a lot of books on the Ottoman Empire per se focus, of course, on the sultans and their idiosyncrasies. I mean, you mentioned Roxelana. What was not mentioned is Roxelana had Suleiman's grand vizier, and essentially his surrogate father, and Suleiman's favorite son and heir apparent, Mustafa, both strangled to death because she saw them as a threat to the ascension of her son to become then the Sultan and the successor to the father. And it was really not about the son. What she wanted was the most vaunted position within the Ottoman royal court, which is being the mother of the Sultan. The Valide Sultan was the most powerful person within the Ottoman court. So there's definitely some reality television intrigue that's going on there. But I think you're going to find, as Dr. Petrovich mentioned, that there is now a lot of Turkish scholarship that is emerging. And I think that you'll find that to be both accessible and, especially if you get it from Turkey, relatively inexpensive. A lot of the other archival work, of course, is either in Ukrainian and Russian, and I don't want to profile you, but I'm imagining those aren't familiar languages with you. Yeah, okay.
I should add, when it comes to Hürrem, because the series was so wildly spectacular and popular in many countries, including the Balkans. It contributed to the rapprochement between Serbia and Turkey because there were so many viewers who were fascinated with this history. So there are actually biographies of Hürrem. One biography is by Leslie Pierce, a renowned American historian. There is also a biography by a Ukrainian historian. Her name escapes me, but it was actually even translated into Turkish. So this is actually now becoming a flourishing. It was somewhat embarrassing when I was in graduate school to study this topic, but this has now become a very, very big topic, precisely because of the uniqueness of the situation. This is actually Tizian or one of his students. So this is the way that they imagined Hürrem or Roxelana. Supposedly, she had red blondish hair. This was part of her appeal. But we also shouldn't forget. It seems that Suleiman himself, that his mother was a Crimean Tatar. Some dispute it, some argue for it. So there is actually a connection from two sides of the Black Sea in their eventual marriage. And this is probably also what appealed to him, on a certain level.
I think we had a question over there first, and then, oh, we got Mike, excellent, okay.
This may be an impossible question to answer, but what does history tell us about the likely outcome of the war in Ukraine?
So the question is, what does history tell us about the likely outcome of the war in Ukraine? Nothing. and that's how it should be. I think what happens oftentimes is we look back to history and we look at analogies in order to then predict the outcome. And don't go to ChatGPT, I don't think it knows either. But I think what's helpful sometimes is recognizing two things. One is that instead of looking at analogy, look at causation. And what was the causal factors to why Putin did what he did, and why the West did what it did. The other thing is, I would argue that we are in a unique time and place in world history when it comes to these broader geopolitical shifts. For the longest time, we saw the West ascendant and we saw the West dominant. And now that is something that is being contested. I could give you the analogy of a similar situation like that happening with the Ottoman Empire, that there was this pivotal period from 1574 to 1699, after which we know that the Ottoman Empire started to decline. And we saw what was happening in its death spasms and how it was then responding, and a lot of what Dr. Petrovich was talking about was within that era. We don't know right now, in many ways, because we don't know what are, for example, Western commitments between its rhetoric and its reality. There has been quite a bit of bombast to say that we're with Ukraine, but that hasn't really translated into the kind of support. And I would argue that the main difference between now and the past is what happened in 1945 with the introduction of the atomic bomb. With us living in a nuclear age, it has changed the dimensions completely. The idea that, for example, in 1914, secret treaties and a certain level of hubris brought so many countries and empires happily into World War I is now something where the risk assessment is completely different. It might simply be that this is another long war that we find playing out, and that's sometimes better when it comes to not having the same kind of volatility, but it doesn't really matter for the people on the ground who are still going to be suffering. But thank you for that question.
We've got that woman left.
Yeah, why don't we'll go one quick question.
Is there any validity in Putin's concentration on the western provinces of Ukraine, saying that they're ethnically different from the rest of Ukraine? I couldn't quite see from the diagrams whether that is a valid assertion or not.
So in the case of, I believe in the eastern side of Ukraine, near Kharkiv, the case is made that they are somewhat ethnically different. You have to remember that this was once part of an empire, and people migrated and they settled where it was either economically or otherwise expedient for them to do so. I would argue that actually the bigger question is not necessarily ethnicity, it's probably more linguistic. And so you have a higher concentration of Russian speakers along the eastern border than you would perhaps in the other parts of the Ukraine. And so it's an easy assertion for him to then make and say, well, these are my people because they speak Russian. But you're going to find ethnic Ukrainians are speaking Russian just because it's the lingua franca. I mean, I'm sure that my speaking, what is it now, the King's English isn't going to necessarily make people think that I'm more British ethnically, just because that's my language, but it is something of a lingua, and I would argue a cultura franca that exists. The people of that area are culturally very, very much part of a mosaic. It just becomes a very easy ploy for Putin to make the argument to then assert whatever his ambitions there. But it's an excellent point, thank you. Well, I'm sorry that we are actually out of time for this session. We hope that it provides a little bit more texture, a little bit more history, and a little bit more understanding to, unfortunately, a major conflict area in the world, which is Crimea. Please join me in thanking Dr. Maya Petrovich for her expertise. Thank you for your patience also with With technology, it isn't always very predictable. We hope you enjoy the rest of your time today at the Bradford Literature Festival and for the entire weekend that you're here. Thank you.